First of all, my name is Sean McDonald, and I am a faculty member in the Program on the Environment at the University of Washington. Tonight, we've got a great panel of experts. I'd like to first just mention them and go ahead and give them a rousing round of applause at your home, wherever you're at. Our first panelist, Kimberly Cartier. She is with EOS Science News by the American Geophysical Union. Why don't you say hi, Kimberly?
Hello, everyone. Good evening.
Great. We also have Eric DePlace. He is with the Sightline Institute in the Green Line. Go ahead and say hello, Eric.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this lovely night.
Yeah. And last but certainly not least, Nives Dolsak with the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington.
Good evening, everyone.
So we're going to go ahead and just launch right into tonight's topic. I do want to point out that when we came up with this topic months ago, A Tale of Two Crises seemed fitting because we were dealing with COVID-19 and also thinking a lot about climate change as we do for these events. But in recent weeks, the country and the world really have been roiled by social unrest as we talk about issues of equity and injustice in the world. And we'll probably touch on those topics a little bit this evening. That it certainly won't be the main focus of tonight's event, but if you do have questions about those things, feel free to ask those as well. And we'll try to have a separate event about justice and equity as it relates to climate change later on in the year. But as I said, we do want to give you an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. This really is an event where we like to have audience participation, not only through the polls, but we want you to have an opportunity to ask the panelists your questions. So if you have questions for our panelists, use the URL on the screen, tinyurl.com/June questions on tap. That will take you to a Google form and you can submit your questions that way. So please keep this URL in mind and feel free to ask your questions throughout the event, especially as we hear from our panelists as they tell you all that they have to say, and you can come up with questions on your own. So let's go ahead and get started with tonight's program. I want to first introduce Professor Nives Dolsak. She's the director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. She studies how common pool resources are governed. She looks at the role of community action, social capital, market-based instruments, as well as traditional regulatory policies. Her research has examined these issues in the context of Washington State, United States, Eastern and Central Europe, as well as the whole world. A special area of focus is global climate change policy that have been developed and implemented from the local to the international level. She has published scholarly and popular articles examining countries' responses to mitigation of global climate change, media coverage, and its impact on the climate change legislative agendas in the United States, implementation of climate change policy, and the impact of civil society and environmental policy in transitional economies. And with that, I just want to say welcome, Dr. Dolsak. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you for having me here. Okay, so for tonight, I've prepared 3 slides to highlight the issues that I think we should be thinking about when we're comparing climate change and corona crisis. And as Sean said, these are the 2 crises, and our hearts are, for many of us, our hearts are on the 3rd crisis, but we'll talk about that one later. Doesn't mean that it's less important, just that that's how the organizers timed the talks. So the first, I want to discuss 3 aspects of how coronavirus and climate crisis are linked. I have 3 slides for 3 points. So the first point is coronavirus and climate crisis are different sorts of policy problems. Many of us want to be optimistic because we see how countries, states, counties, cities have responded to coronavirus. We realize that the problems are somewhat similar in the way that if the problem is solved for one person, the problem is solved for all people. That is, if a climate change is halted, the gas guzzlers drivers will benefit as well as the electric car drivers will benefit. So both benefit. If coronavirus outbreak is under control, those who wash their hands assiduously and wear masks all the time will be just as protected as those who ignore all of those recommendations. So from that perspective, everyone benefits from controlling these two problems. And when we see how coronavirus has been addressed relatively successfully, relatively rapidly, we want to be optimistic that the climate change will also be addressed. The reason is, there are many reasons why that will not likely be the case. So on this slide, I want to highlight the differences between the two issues. The first aspect I want to point out is that penalties for policy and behavioral procrastination are very different. Climate change is occurring slowly. We feel that we have time to act. We feel that we have time to adapt. We feel that we have time to decarbonize our economy. On the other hand, coronavirus strikes much more rapidly within a couple of weeks. For an individual, for society takes a little bit longer, but still much shorter than for the climate crisis. And because of this shorter timeline, we see a lot more rapid and deep and effective response to corona crisis than we see to climate change. So that's one important difference. Another important difference is what Asim Prakash and I call spatial optimism. And the points that I'm making today have all been from 3 of our articles that we publish on Forbes.com with regular contributors, so you can follow us there. So the second point that I mentioned is called spatial optimism. With climate change, the data show in the United States that we tend to think of climate change problems as those happening to somebody else. We don't think we are vulnerable. Even though we see climate change, we believe in scientific information, but we just don't think it's going to happen to us. With coronavirus, that kind of spatial optimism, as in the sense of this is somebody else's problem, it was there a little bit when it was just a Wuhan crisis, but the moment it reached the United States, that spatial optimism went away. And that is the absence of spatial optimism when it comes to coronavirus, again, leads to much faster and more effective policy response in the coronavirus case. The third difference is the belief in the efficacy of response strategies or adaptation. With climate change, we feel we have the time. We feel that we will develop technologies to capture and store carbon. We will develop technologies to generate electricity in a way that reduces carbon dioxide emissions. We believe in efficacy of building walls that will protect us from sea level rise. On the other hand, with coronavirus, we're not even sure what we should be doing. We're not even sure if washing hands is working or not. We don't know if wearing masks is working or not. So we are a lot more worried that with coronavirus, we don't have as effective way of protecting ourselves as we do in climate change. Another difference is that in coronavirus, we have lower incentives to attack scientific knowledge. What Dr. Birx says, what Dr. Fauci says is taken very seriously. Initially it wasn't, there was a bit of a delay, but nevertheless now it's taken very seriously. With climate change, there is very strong incentive to attack scientific knowledge. The incentive has been there. The industry that loses with the rapid and deep decarbonization, which is the fossil fuel industry, has all the incentives to block action and to question scientific knowledge. Do we have enough knowledge? Do we trust it? Are the probabilities really as high as the scientists tell us? Do we really have so little time as scientists tell us? In coronavirus, we don't attack scientific knowledge the same way, predominantly because there is no industry that would really benefit drastically from attacking scientific knowledge. As a matter of fact, most industries want coronavirus and corona outbreak to get resolved because they are hurting economically. So another reason why we're seeing rapid, deep response to coronavirus, whereas we don't see that in climate change. And the last difference I want to point out is the depth, the scale, and the duration of changes that are required to control the two kinds of crisis. For climate change, We will need deep decarbonization. The scale is global. It will impact many of our economic activities, the way we work, the way we do leisure. So much larger scale. The duration of changes will have to be much longer. With coronavirus, that is less the case. Yes, we don't have the vaccine yet. Yes, it may take us a year, maybe even 2 years. But then once we have the vaccine, we no longer have to be as proactive and as cautious as we are now. With climate change, those changes will have to be long-term and permanent. So these are the key reasons why when I look at coronavirus and how states, cities, counties are responding to it, and this, I want to be optimistic. I really am not, because I'm aware of all these differences. Next slide, Sean, please. The second issue I want to point out is that both climate transition and coronavirus outbreak have very important equity concerns and difficult equity concerns. As I argued on the previous slide, everybody benefits if we control coronavirus outbreak, and everybody benefits if we control climate change, or at least halt climate change. But who bears the costs? It's very clear that costs are not borne uniformly. If we're thinking about coronavirus, if we're thinking about what I call here a Zoom economy, Zoom economy is not equitable. Many of us on this call are probably very professionally successful teleworking. I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher. I can do a lot of my work simply from the safety of my home, use the technology that's available to me. And I live in Washington State where the internet quality is really high. That's not necessarily the case for other professions. Not everyone can telework. If you are serving food in a restaurant, if you're a hairstylist, many other professions, you cannot perform that work through teleworking, through Zoom. So clearly in some professions, we are a lot more secure and a lot more protected, a lot safer than other people are in other professions. In the coronavirus case, there are professionals who keep the economy going, and we don't necessarily always realize who they are. And I call that here who are the unsung heroes. It's all the people who provide first response. It's police, firemen, of course it's doctors, nurses. It's those who deliver and pack our groceries. It's those who bring packages to the door when we cannot go shopping for the essentials. All of those are what I call the unsung heroes. And in many professions, they are very poorly protected. And they clearly bear a lot higher burden than some of us. Similarly, decarbonization also has equity implications. If we're thinking about decarbonizing transportation, do we invest in public transportation, which benefits one subset of population, or do we invest in charging stations for electric cars? There's fewer owners of electric cars. So where do we invest our public money? Who's going to benefit from decarbonization efforts in our society? And the last aspect about the equity on climate change I want to highlight is, again, who bears the burden of halting climate change, global warming. Richard Trumka at the 2018 Global Climate Summit, he's the AFL-CIO president, he says, I quote, "I would ask each of you, does your plan for fighting climate change ask more from the sick retired coal miners than it does from you and your family? If it does, then you need to think again." So, as I said, in both instances, we have very important and difficult equity concerns that we will have to address. And we don't have great policy approaches to address them in either place. We're beginning to, but we'll have to do a lot better. Sean, the last slide for me, please. The last issue I want to point out when we're comparing coronavirus and climate change is that the supply chain disruption that we saw in the coronavirus outbreak really ought to be a wake-up call for climate policy. What we've seen with corona is that coronavirus outbreak is that we saw a drastic disruption in global renewable markets. We saw disruption in global markets, period, but also in renewable markets. And we're not just, I don't want to highlight just the disruption in markets of solar panels or electric batteries. I mean, those could be produced in many places. What we need to be aware of is that there's disruption in the supply of materials. And it's not just the disruption in the supply of materials, it's also where they come from. Many critical materials, many rare earth elements come from developing countries with less than stellar governance, with weak governments, and we ought to be worried about them. For example, cobalt is really not regulated, even though we have regulated and prevented some minerals coming from the conflict-ridden countries. We don't do that for cobalt. We, meaning in the US, we don't do it, and Europeans don't do it either. So they regulate others, but not cobalt. And it's crucial for electric car batteries. So Congo, in my opinion, symbolizes the problems of meeting the mineral needs of developed economies. And the supply chain disruption of coronavirus really brought it home for us that when we have decarbonization strategy, we need to be talking about where will the supply of those critical materials and rare earth minerals come from, rare earth elements come from. So I'll stop now. I hope I didn't take more than allotted time or much more. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to chat more later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nives. That was a wonderful overview, and it got us thinking about similarities and differences. And as we think about tackling these huge issues, COVID-19, climate transitions, I really like the way that you laid that out, those three parts. As I mentioned earlier, for the folks attending this evening, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please go ahead and share those with us using our online form. You can use the URL that's on your screen right now to submit your questions. Just type in tinyurl.com/June questions on tap. That will take you to a Google form, and you can submit your questions, and those will be relayed to us here. So I'd like to go ahead now and introduce our next speaker. Now that we've gotten an overview of similarities and differences in tackling these challenges from a policy standpoint, I want to turn our attention to thinking about energy and how we might see changes in energy and what changes might be wrought by coronavirus. Our next speaker, Eric DePlace, directs Sightline Institute's Thin Green Line project devoted to shedding light on coal, oil, and gas development. During nearly 2 decades at Sightline, Eric has earned a reputation as an authority on a range of issues, as well as an effective advocate who shapes public policy at the state and local level. His successes include research-based efforts to roll back oil industry tax loopholes, halt dirty energy projects, defeat right-wing property rights initiatives, expose shady PR firms, advance regional climate policy, and much more. He's published more than 1,000 pieces of popular writing and technical analysis on sustainability issues, and his work has been featured in hundreds of news media stories, including Time Magazine, New York Times, Washington Post, Fox News, CNN, Vox, NPR, The Guardian, and scores of other outlets. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and just welcome Eric DePlace and have you take over. Thank you, Eric.
Great, thanks, Sean. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone for spending time tonight on this lovely summer evening. I love sort of the frame of this whole talk, which is framed around two crises. As Sean sort of suggested earlier, I actually think there are more than two at work. There's at least climate change and the pandemic, and then I think there's they're good candidates for another 3 slots with economic collapse, race, and justice issues. And I would make an argument for a crisis of democracy as well. But I'm not going to talk about most of that. I'm just going to talk about really the energy stuff and kind of try to ground us. And Sean, could you actually skip ahead 2 slides? The first one is just sort of introducing Sightline Institute. Go back 1. There you go. Sightline Institute is a public policy think tank. We're based in Seattle. We work across the Northwest, but our work is frequently more expansive than that. We work on all kinds of questions: housing affordability, democracy, and so forth. I'm going to focus really just on energy and just on the story of a particular part of the energy economy as it's affected the Pacific Northwest over the last decade, because I think it illustrates very clearly the nature of these sort of twin challenges or crises that we're facing. And then I'm actually going to do a longer version of this talk tomorrow morning. So if anybody isn't quite bored enough with me tonight, you can join Sightline Institute tomorrow. You can just send me an email and I'll give you the invitation to that. So if you could skip to the next slide, this notion of the thin green line was really born by sort of my crude attempts to do some cartography. And what this map indicates on the right-hand side of those red blobs are some of the biggest carbon fuel deposits anywhere on Earth. The Athabascan tar sands, the Bakken Shale Formation, which contains a lot of oil that's obtainable by fracking, Powder River Basin coal in the south. And on the left-hand side are some of the fastest growing energy markets on Earth. And right around 2011, 2012, not quite 10 years ago, we found ourselves this region, which is really not important, hasn't historically been important to global energy trade, become majorly important. In fact, I think one of the most important regions anywhere in the world. And I know a lot of folks probably watching tonight remember all too well this, what felt like almost a pandemic scale outbreak of fossil fuel export proposals. So all of a sudden we saw 7 new coal export proposals plus expansions of 3 more in British Columbia, at least 12 oil by rail facilities, a couple of major gas pipelines to LNG export stations in Oregon and Washington, or in Oregon, and then a whole bunch more, maybe a dozen more in British Columbia. We saw petrochemical facilities. Like you can just go on and on. In a longer version of this talk, I explore more of that. But if you go to the next slide, I did a little sort of math that tried to explain during this time just how important what was going on in the Northwest was. And that bar on the right is the Keystone XL pipeline. So that's all the oil that would flow through that pipeline if it were built. And if it were built and operated at full capacity and you burned out oil in a year, you'd emit about that much carbon dioxide. On the right-hand side, that's just new project proposals just in the Pacific Northwest, just since 2012. And so you can stack them up: gas pipelines, oil by rail, oil by pipe, coal terminals. And by conservative accounting, you can get to 5, and probably more realistically, it's like 8 times. And it's kind of, that was the sort of regional instantiation of the climate crisis. All of a sudden, this region that had really prioritized environmental leadership and climate leadership found itself about, really sort of in an identity crisis, about to become a major exporter of carbon fuels to the rest of the world, with potentially catastrophic implications for the climate. There's a longer version of this talk. Again, I'm skipping all that. Fast forward through a decade of fighting, extremely successful fighting all across the region that stopped most of these projects, which I'll get to at the end. But in the next slide, I wish we had a way to do a chat function, but some of you who were English majors instead of science majors may know where this quote comes from. You could skip to the next slide. It's one of my favorite passages from one of the most famous books in American literature. Anyone? Any of the panelists know? How did you go bankrupt, Bill asked. 2 ways, Mike said: gradually and then suddenly. And gradually and then suddenly, I think, is going to be my mantra for the rest of 2020, because I think it really speaks to a lot of the way that we're addressing these crises. And that it's from The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, published almost 100 years ago. But gradually and then suddenly is actually a pretty good way to think about what's happened to the oil and gas industry. 10 years ago, actually, we all thought that the coal industry was so politically powerful and so economically powerful that they could steamroll this region and build 7 coal export terminals here. That's a joke nowadays. Nobody thinks that. The coal industry is somewhere around the typewriter industry in terms of political power. It's not an influential industry in most parts of the country or even the world anymore. If you go to the next slide, this is what I mean by gradually and then suddenly. The oil and gas industry has been under duress for a long time. They were struggling. You could hit that button 2 more times, Sean. They were struggling a lot in 2019 and late 2019 and early 2020, and then the coronavirus hit with the subsequent economic collapse, And you could pull headlines like this all day long. I just grabbed 3 randomly for the last couple of days. Many folks know that future prices went negative earlier in the year. That was sort of a trading aberration, but suffice it to say that the industry is in dire, dire straits and will probably never recover to the level that it's been in the past. In fact, Moody's today, which is a credit ratings agency, just said that they think that peak oil may have already happened. We may never see levels of oil consumption again in the way that we haven't seen in the past. That's not to say that we've solved the climate crisis, because that's not true. We still have way too much oil consumption, and we have a lot to do to rid ourselves of the plague, so to speak, of fossil fuel addiction. But just to say that the industry had been accumulating debt, literal debt, and also moral debt, and a bunch of other problems. And when this hit, it was catastrophe. And so we have, in a way, an opportunity to exploit that catastrophe. If you go to the next slide, we have another quote by another famous American. And unfortunately, no way to quiz the audience on this. I'd love to do this trivia style. This was said, does any of the panelists know who said this? This was Warren Buffett, who said this: only when the tide goes out do you see who's been swimming naked. And he was referring to what happens during a market downturn, and he's really right in the sense that he's so quotable, but he's really right in the sense that the economic collapse that has ensued from our response to coronavirus has really revealed that the industry is financially a house of cards. And it's been a very problematic industry, obviously, for a whole bunch of reasons. But it is worth thinking about the impacts that it will have on communities all across the country and across the continent and the world as it slowly goes bust. There are real risks of taxpayer bailouts. I don't really have time to get into that issue tonight, probably. But we have seen in the past what happens when the fossil fuel industry packs up and leaves town. We've seen that in Appalachia. We've seen that in lots of other parts of the world. And the results can be very, very damaging. They have long-term, decade-long, centuries-long consequences for places. And so I think it's one of the things I'm trying to get people to do nowadays, is to think really carefully about, the places that supply the Northwest with oil, crude oil, are going to be hurt very badly and are already hurt very badly by the economic collapse. And we have, I think, as people who are advocating for a transition to a cleaner energy economy, some responsibility to those places who have been, they've been drilling our oil and sending it to us because we love to burn it so much. And so there's some special attention we probably need to pay to Alaska and North Dakota and Alberta, even while we do what we can to unwind the industry there. So sort of swiveling back to the Pacific Northwest and all those projects I mentioned earlier, Sean, if you want to skip to the next slide. Over the course of 8 or 9 years, a dedicated cadre of activists and business leaders, huge contributions from indigenous communities, a lot of folks with a lot of people putting their shoulder to the wheel, managed to beat back almost literally every single one of those projects that came our way. There was probably not a comparable anti-fossil fuels movement anywhere in the world, in my opinion. What happened in the Northwest is really quite astonishing, and I feel very fortunate to have been kind of hanging around while it happened. I don't take much credit for it, but I'm extremely gratified to have been around for it. We still have 3 big ones on the table. I'll skip through these really quickly because I know we're running short on time. The Jordan Cove LNG export project in Coos Bay, Oregon, will almost certainly collapse now, owing to both regulatory pressure and financial. There's no market for it anymore, at least not in the near term. The methanol refining project in Kalama will also probably die for financial reasons as well as regulatory issues. But tragically, the one that I think may slip through is the Trans Mountain Oil Pipeline through Canada, which poses an enormous environmental risk to the San Juan Islands into tribal treaty rights. And largely that's because it's of the virtues of socialism, which protects people ideally from the whiplash of market forces. And in this case, because the Canadian government purchased that pipeline, it may protect the pipeline from the vicissitudes of the market. Because right now our best friend would be the market simply tearing that project apart, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'll skip, if you would, Sean, to the last slide. I think the connection that I'd like to sort of leave folks with is, this was something that was said by an oil industry executive who kept trying to get projects built here. And he said this to the press: everybody outside the Northwest thinks that's where energy projects go to die. totally right about this. It's the only thing that Lou and I have ever agreed about. And I think it is, to me, encouraging that it is entirely possible through concerted collective action and a commitment to honoring the truth of science, that we can make huge change. Nobody, not even I did not think that it was possible to beat these projects back when they came. Many people have been bearish about responding to coronavirus too. I take very seriously the notion that they're not the same from a public policy response. There are profound differences between them. But I do, even at my advanced age of 46, I remain profoundly optimistic. I don't think we're going to prevent climate change from happening. That's not possible at this point. But I think we're going to do a tremendous amount of good work over the next even 5 to 10 years. And I think 10 years from now, the energy industry looks nothing like it looks today, which I think will be very positive for a whole bunch of reasons. I hope I didn't go too long over time, but I got kind of excited while I was talking. Thanks for having me on tonight, Sean.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Hey, we like your excitement and your enthusiasm for this topic for sure. If you have questions for Eric, please go ahead and send those to us using the URL that you're seeing here on your screen right now, tinyurl.com/June questions on tap. We would be happy to answer your questions during the Q&A period, which will be coming up in just a few minutes. But first, we have our last panelist this evening. Our last panelist, Dr. Kimberly Cartier, is a science writer and journalist for EOS, the news branch of the American Geophysical Union. She earned her doctorate degree in astrophysics while studying planetary systems and now reports on discoveries that run the gamut of Earth and space sciences. She is a member of the National Association of Science Writers, the DC Science Writers Association, the Society of Professional Journalists, and Graduate Women in Science. For the past 3 years, Kimberly has written about the sources, consequences, and reality of climate change and the hurdles we need to overcome to meet this crisis. And I reached out specifically to Kimberly because she wrote an article not too long ago that specifically looked at the issue of COVID-19 or coronavirus as it relates to climate change and the lessons that we might learn from that. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Kimberly. Kimberly, please.
Thanks so much, Sean. So tonight I want to talk to all of you about how we talk about climate change and other scientific crises of our time. And by that, I mean how other people talk to us, meaning how we get our information, and then how we talk to each other about these issues. And then I'm going to talk about what we need to do in order to get better at both of those things. I'm going to start with the solutions. So Sean, if you could go to the next slide. The first thing that we need to do and get better at is learning how to separate fact from fiction when it comes to scientific crises, because it literally saves lives. And there was an interesting study that I read recently that said that non-scientists were disproportionately bad at identifying false information when it comes to climate change compared to how they do at identifying false information about general science like physics and chemistry and biology. And that is not terribly surprising. If you could go to the next slide. And I don't think it would shock anyone if I tell you that misinformation about climate change and about the coronavirus is literally everywhere. I think something like more than 50% of all YouTube videos about climate change contain climate misinformation. That's how pervasive that it is. And that's on purpose. There is a communication strategy surrounding climate skepticism and around coronavirus skepticism. And that may sound sort of like a conspiracy theory, but it's actually a very well-documented phenomenon that's been going on for longer than I've been alive. It's the same strategy that was used decades ago around DDT, around smoking, around acid rain. It's already been used for decades around climate change, and now we're seeing it come into play with coronavirus too. The whole if you want to read more about that, I highly recommend Naomi Oreskes' Merchants of Doubt. You can read it or watch it. It's a great documentary. The whole point of this strategy is to sow confusion and doubt in our minds about what is real regarding these scientific crises, and then to get us to hesitate to do anything about them. As Nives said earlier, it makes us question what is real, what is right. It's a strategy that is used over and over again because it works for a time. It works for a little time. And that's really all that the people who benefit need. And the way we combat this is by getting our news from actually trustworthy sources. And I would highly recommend away from any sort of partisan politics in the US or otherwise, wherever you fall on the political spectrum, from Fox News to MSNBC, get your scientific facts from nonpartisan sources. Talk to the scientists themselves. And that's the best way that we can start to combat that particular strategy. I don't think it would surprise anyone else if I say that we're starting to see that the same people who have been doubting climate science for decades are, and I'm talking about regular citizens here, are the same sorts of people that are hesitating to wear masks in public now. And that's because it's the same strategy and the same people getting their news from the same sources. So in order to fix this, we need to diversify where we're getting our science news from. And as we're doing this, we have to remember that scientific crises like this, they aren't the great equalizers, they're the great revealers of all of the inequities and inequalities built into our societies. So as you're evaluating coronavirus news and climate change news, ask yourself, who is benefiting from us not doing anything about this, and who is paying the price? And that will often tell you what's the right thing to do and what not to do. So the next thing I want to bring up, before I do, I want each of you who's watching to think about two particular questions. And they're very simple yes or no questions. The first one is, have you in the last month talked about the coronavirus pandemic to someone in your life? I hope the answer is yes for most of us. The second question is, have you in the last month talked about the climate crisis to someone in your life? And I suspect that that particular number is lower than for the first question. So my second recommendation, if we could go to the next slide, is we need to talk about the crisis that is going on. Both crises, all the crises, because that's how real change happens. So if we could go to the next slide. If any of you said that you didn't talk about climate change in the past month, you are not alone. These data from the climate communications folks at Yale show us that even though a majority of Americans believe that climate change is real, we may disagree about why it's happening, but we all agree that it's happening and that it affects us. Very few of us are actually talking about it to our friends, our families, our coworkers in our daily lives. Our local news stations aren't covering it. Our local radio stations aren't covering it. And that's a problem, because as we've seen with the coronavirus pandemic, as we saw last year with Australia's wildfires, when we start to understand how these crises affect our personal lives, our communities, that's when we start to actually take action. With the wildfires in Australia, it was all of our heartstrings getting tugged when it came to the koala bears. When it comes to coronavirus pandemic, as Nives said, when it started showing up on our shores here in the US, when we started realizing that it would affect our friends and family and our loved ones, that's when we started taking it really seriously. And we haven't done that with climate change yet. So when you do go and talk about it, if we could go to the next slide real quick. There are a couple things that you need to keep in mind when you talk about climate change or coronavirus to anyone in your life. The first is that stories change minds a lot more often than facts do, which is perhaps a slightly depressing thing to think about. But if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe that the pandemic is really as serious as it is, or that climate change isn't going to affect them, just stating contrary facts or facts contrary to their personal beliefs won't actually change their mind. And in fact, it'll often get them more deeply entrenched in their personal ideology. So what you need to do is tell a story. As I said, when we started thinking about, the people in nursing homes that were being disproportionately affected by the pandemic, we started taking it more seriously. With climate change, If we start thinking about the fishing villages in the Arctic who can no longer support their way of life because of warming conditions, when we think about farmers in the Midwest who can't support their families anymore because crops are being destroyed from droughts and floods, when we think about communities on the eastern seaboard who are getting hammered year after year by worsening hurricanes and more frequent storms, these are the things that bring it home to people. We need to focus on what is affecting people's lives so that people understand the personal risk and the community risk that they're assuming, because that's the thing that spurs action. Things like calling your Congress people and getting them to take action, getting people out to the polls to vote, getting people to sponsor climate change panels on their local school boards. All of those types of actions that lead to change only come from when we make personal connections with the crisis. We need to focus on the solutions. As much as it may feel like doom and gloom out in the world, we can't focus on the doom and gloom so much when we're trying to talk about this to other people. Focusing on solutions makes people feel powerful, like they can do something, that they can take action. With coronavirus, we know some things that we can do to make it better. We can wash our hands and wear masks and socially distance and stay at home and wait for a vaccine to come to us. These are the solutions that we know. With climate change, we know how to fix it. That's the thing, is that we know what the solution is. We just aren't doing it. So focus on the things that can be done, and that'll help us have these conversations in a more productive way. And the last thing I want to make sure to bring up is when you are talking to people about climate change, about coronavirus, and God forbid any other scientific crises as they come along, just remember to listen to what the other person is saying with empathy. You know, it's difficult for farmers to abruptly change what crops that they're planting. It's difficult for small business owners to abruptly change their business model to be greener or to adjust to a pandemic like coronavirus. In the end, we're all people just trying to do better, hopefully trying to do better, and just, you know, keep that empathy going as you're listening and having these conversations. So thank you, and I hope to take your questions later.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for sharing that with us. I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions for our panelists, please go ahead and use our online form to share those out. You can use the tinyurl.com/June questions on tap to reach our Google form, submit your questions there, and those will be fed to us so that we can address them as part of our Q&A. And at this point, actually, I would like to go ahead and stop sharing this screen so that we can actually have a conversation. And as we're waiting for our questions to come in from the panelists, from the audience, I just want to say thank you to the three of you for sharing your insight with us this evening. You know, I have already gotten a list of questions here from our audience, and so I think we should just go ahead and dive in. And please, as we're going through these questions, I know some of them are addressed to you individually as panelists, but if you have other insight to add, please jump in. You can feel free to ask each other questions as well, based on what you've heard during the conversation this evening. I guess what I can do is perhaps start off with a question that we received from the audience that maybe could be addressed to all of you. And that is really the question of whether or not you think, if we think about sort of the airspace, the amount of room in the news hole, so to speak, for different topics. We think about how much space climate change has taken up for over years, and then really what's happened over the last few months, maybe since December, since COVID-19 became a major global issue. First, do you think that people in general have an appetite to be thinking about climate change and climate and energy transitions right now, along with some of these other crises? maybe we'll start with you, Kimberly, since you work in the news.
Well, I certainly hope that people do have an appetite for it, because that's sort of what my job is. I do actually think that there is an appetite for more climate news than what we've seen in the past decade. There really has not been all that much coverage about climate change itself. Some on the international and national level, especially when it comes to activism that's happened in the past few years with things like the Sunrise Movement. However, that coverage drops drastically when you talk about local news, which is where a lot of people do get their news. I think one of the best ways that we can, whet that appetite is, like I was saying before, focus on actionable things, focus on solutions and things that people can do. I think one thing that this pandemic has showed us is that despite all of our individual actions, like stopping traveling and driving everywhere, that's not actually going to solve the climate crisis itself, because the majority of it is from industry. However, that doesn't mean that individual people can't do anything. And so I think the more we focus on what people can do, the more of an appetite for it people will have. They know it's happening, they know it's bad, they know it'll affect them, us, but they need to know what to do.
Right. Nives, Eric, either of you have anything that you'd like to add?
Sure,
Yeah,
I can go.
Go ahead.
No, people do not have appetite for climate change when the unemployment is 13.3% in the United States, right? I mean, there's problems that require, just like doctors decide which problem needs to be addressed first and which one can wait a little, the same thing we need to do in public policy. The first issue is make sure people don't fall ill and don't die. The second thing is restart the economy. What we have to make sure, all of us who care about climate change, is that climate change doesn't fall off completely from the radar. And the way we should be talking about that is, as we restart the economy, as we have the stimulus, as we hand out stimulus money, that stimulus money should be linked to green energy. That would be my very quick answer. Eric, to you.
I think I agree with bits of both. I mean, people respond to threats, and so the coronavirus is a threat. It's right in front of our faces, so we have to respond to it. The problem with climate change has always been that it's long-term and distant and spatially distant and all the rest of it. Now, I think the lesson from fighting energy projects is that when somebody tries to site a coal terminal in your backyard or a pipeline in your backyard, people freak out. And so what we saw over the region was, public participation attendance records in a million different forums, because people don't want that stuff. And so I think it's entirely possible to get people focused on particular actions and particular responses to particular threats. But climate change itself it's almost too conceptual. And I don't know how important it is for people to be really upset about climate change in particular, as a general concept, in order to actually resolve the problems of climate change. People need to focus on the things that they actually have control over, which are mostly through the levers of public policy in their political state. That's my view.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You should mention that, things that people have control over. And I think I, for a long time, subscribed to the camp of individual choices and personal action, and how that might be used to impact climate change. If I drive less, if I fly less, if I put solar panels on my house, I feel like maybe you all could speak to this, but it seems that the evidence that we're seeing, based on the dramatic decline in production overall, commuting, travel, that although we're seeing a dip in greenhouse gas emissions, we're not seeing enough of a dip. Can any of you respond to that? That's conversation about whether or not we feel like personal action is sort of the nail in the coffin of personal action. Do we really need to focus on the level of policy more broadly?
I think we have to focus on both. Especially in the US, we have now seen many lessons and experienced many lessons that if we just wait for the public policy, it's not going to happen. Legislators will flee to a different state just to avoid taking a vote on limiting carbon in state, Oregon being the case. In Washington, and we're talking about environmental states here. In Washington, the governor wants its own agencies to limit carbon emissions, And the legislature says, no, governor, you cannot tell your agencies what they should be doing. So we're seeing a backlash in green, in pro-environment states. And that to me suggests that we can absolutely not rely just on public policy. We have to rely on individuals and how they behave, how they change, how they change their behavior, how much they fly, how much they drive, what products they buy, how much they buy rather than just what they buy, because we know that the consumption is a major culprit of emission. So I absolutely believe that we need a portfolio of all actions, state policies, of course, for structural change, but also individual behavior, because the structural change may be very slow in coming. Though I do see, as Eric pointed out, changes in oil industry simply responding to market pressure. So I'm not ignoring those. But when I'm looking at policies, I am somewhat skeptical, and I'm a political scientist by training.
I have to 100% agree with what Nives said about all of this. And I would just like to add that I think in the past few weeks, we've definitely seen how individual action can influence policy on a large scale as well. So in addition to all of our individual actions towards cutting our personal carbon footprint, large scale activism from the public can influence policy on a national level in a very big and very important way.
That's a perfect segue to my point, which is I want to go back to this gradually but suddenly thing. I mean, there are so many examples of this happening through history, and we're seeing it right now, maybe with race issues and police violence issues, where I mean, people have been fighting those issues for forever, basically, and all of a sudden there's this window opens and dramatic change happens with shocking rapidity. That can happen in good ways and bad ways, obviously. But I think we're seeing it across kind of all of the crises that we've been talking about tonight. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that it can't happen with climate change too at some level. We can't actually take the carbon out of the atmosphere very quickly, but I think we can get rapid shifts in sort of public consciousness and even political action. We just don't know when that window is going to open. That's my view. Maybe it's Pollyanna, but I don't disagree with anything that anyone has said. But except that this last period has been profound for me because we've seen events happen at a speed that I don't think we're not familiar with that kind of speed, at least in North America. Some parts of the world have seen it.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that folks in our audience remember that our panelists are taking questions from you at the using our Google form, the tinyurl.com/June questions on tap. Please go to that link and submit your questions using the Google form. I want to go ahead and ask one of the questions that our audience has submitted, because I think it's actually a really interesting one in thinking about what we've, what I think we've talked a little bit, or maybe we've already mentioned this idea that people are flying less. There are certain things about COVID-19 crisis that have had positive impacts on the climate, but one of the things that one of our attendees, our audience members, asked about is this issue of density in cities, public transportation. These are all thought of as tools that we might be able to use to address climate issues. If we think about dense cities with very efficient public transportation systems, that can limit our overall footprint on this planet, but also think about ways to reduce our carbon footprint as well. But yet at the same time, these situations where people are packed together very tightly pose a huge public health issue, especially as it comes to infectious disease. Anyone want to speak to that issue?
Here is where the two crises move in the opposite direction, right? We are seeing in the US real estate market move into suburbia, while we have seen a lot of interest in very active and interesting downtown living and condos, definitely in Seattle. We've seen that in many big cities, yet now we're seeing the reverse and people moving to suburbia. And that could potentially hurt us, because I absolutely agree with the person in the audience who asked the question. We do need higher density for public transportation to work well. But then I'm hoping that when we when we feel safe again, and we ask how have we responded individually and as a society, and our firms, our employers, when we all ask ourselves, how can we keep any of those changes that we have adopted? Let's hope that we keep some of them. I was listening to Konstantin, I was listening to the King County executive this morning, and he was saying how they have actually noticed in King County that teleworking has increased the level of engagement, that teleworking, they may actually keep some employees in the future, teleworking, working from home. So I'm hoping that, yes, while I absolutely agree the two crises may be moving us in the opposite direction from the perspective of where we reside and how far we have to go to work, I'm hoping that the COVID has persuaded some of us that we can do a lot of things remotely. I hope that at least our federal agencies will now not expect all of us to fly to Washington, D.C. to have a productive meeting just so that they can say, yes, the panel has met and met productively. We've heard those points in the past where federal agencies felt that teleworking is just not quite appropriate and not quite productive enough. So hopefully with COVID, we've learned how to do teleworking better. We learned how to be productive remotely. I hope that at least some of our professional organizations have learned that they don't have to have national and international conferences every year, that they can maybe have them every other year. And in between, they can have regional or they can have online conferences. So I'm hoping that COVID has forced us, was enough of a crisis to force us to adapt and rethink how we do, think out of the box. And I'm hoping that some of that will stay. But I do recognize that when it comes to where we live, COVID may have the opposite impact of what we would want for at least public transportation aspect of climate change.
Yeah, and I think that it's a really interesting point to think about, because at the same time, people might be thinking, well, it's safer to live out in the suburbs. It's also perhaps cheaper to commute now, right, Eric? I mean, if gas prices are going down, if oil prices are going down, wouldn't it seem more attractive? And if it is more attractive, is there anything that we can do at the policy level to disincentivize that sort of activity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything really that's more intelligent to say, but I mean, yes, we have countervailing forces on a lot of this stuff, and this is why, I mean, I don't like it. I don't like that it's true, but it's probably easier to ride this out in the suburbs in a big house, so your kids who are doing online learning or some other room, not crammed in the same room with you in an apartment, it's probably easier to socially distance in a large physical space. Congestion is way down. It's easier to drive. Like, I don't like that stuff. I don't want it to be true, but it's probably true. And so, there's so much of this stuff we just don't know how it's going to shake out. I'm dubious that there'll be much intention in the way that the telecommuting one's maybe the counterexample to what I'm saying. So that's a place where I think we might actually, employers might actually devote good thinking and intention to come up with something better. But I think for a lot of it, we're just going to kind of muddle back into some, system that sort of half works and half doesn't, which is how we've ended up with so many systems we have already. So I don't know. I don't have anything intelligent to say. Sorry, I've stopped talking a while ago.
Well, maybe I'll give you something intelligent. Maybe I'll throw you one that you can say something intelligent about. One of our audience members asks, because you've told us a little bit about the energy market and fossil fuel industry and the point that they're at. I mean, basically the water's gone out, everybody's naked. Are we ready now to transition to something beyond fossil fuels? Do you feel like the renewables markets, if you will, are poised? Are we ready to transition?
I mean, yes and no. The renewables markets have also been hurt pretty badly, actually, by the current. I mean, lots of markets have been hurt by it. There aren't very many that have done well. I think it's not clear. I mean, I would like to say that the answer is yes, and it should be yes, but yeah, my focus has really been, and I think we under-attend to the need to defeat our opposition. The clean energy economy hopefully will arrive, and we should be attentive to building it up and to structuring public policy that supports it. That's super important. I don't want to diminish that at all, but it is also the case that we can't solve climate change without actually decarbonizing, and decarbonizing is a negative word because we have to physically take carbon and carbon infrastructure out of the built environment. So right now we need to decarbonize our cities by removing probably gas infrastructure. We need to decarbonize. We need to eventually think about how do we shut off the oil refineries? How do we decommission oil pipelines? Like that's kind of the world that I live in. On that score, we've kind of got a lot of green lights right now. Things look pretty good actually because the industry is weaker than it's ever been, and it probably since its inception. And so we have the opportunity now to dismantle our opposition. That does not necessarily equate to we get to build a happy new world, but I'm hopeful that that we can. But it's not straightforward. I think in part because public budgets are savaged right now. We don't have good opportunities for public investment in a lot of arenas right now. Stimulus money being pegged to green energy is certainly an interesting idea. I worry that it would actually slow the stimulus effect, but maybe it's a, you know, so I don't know. I think it's complicated and tricky. I'll leave it there, I guess.
I would like to add something quickly to this, and it comes from the third slide. So maybe it's a repeat of my third slide. Absolutely, we have to decommission oil. We have to move away from fossil fuels. But let's not forget that we are not quite sure where some of those critical materials will be coming, where some of those rare earth elements will be coming. If we drastically increase solar, if we drastically increase the number of electric cars, we will have to have those materials. We don't like mining in Alaska. We are really bad at recycling batteries, a lot worse than Europe. So we need to have, when we're talking about greening our energy, we have to be transparent, and we have to say, this is where these critical materials will come from. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Nives. Thank you for bringing that up. Another one of our audience members was really keyed in on this word spatial optimism and the spatial optimism issue. I mean, I love it as a term, and so does this audience member. The point that this person wants to get at is this idea, and getting back to equity and justice issues that I think every single one of you mentioned at one point. How do we, maybe I'll just go ahead and ask the question that this person has laid out. How do we balance the message being true and morally significant, so the message that climate impacts disproportionately impact developing nations or the global south and more marginalized communities? How do we balance this message being true and morally significant, but also potentially harmful for climate action because it exacerbates this spatial optimism problem? So it's affecting others. That is a moral problem, but it's not something that's affecting me here now.
I'm wondering if that's really true. Is it really not affecting us here? Just think about what happened to electricity supply in California during wildfires. Is it really not impacting us? Or have we just not internalized those costs in our cost of food and in our cost of energy? And Asim and I, with some colleagues, have done some survey experiments where we had given different amount of information to respondents about how much we know how climate change is going to cost us. And we have seen increase in willingness to mitigate climate change. The higher the information we have, the more specific we are about how much climate change is going to cost us in the future, the more likely people are to support mitigation. So they don't trade off. They don't say, oh, okay, we're just going to adapt. No, they even increase support for mitigation. So yes, it's going to impact disproportionately poor people. It's going to impact disproportionately people in developing countries. But we also have to learn, and this is, I think, where Kimberly's work comes in, and Eric's analytical work. We have to learn how to communicate the true costs of climate change that we will be paying. We're just not thinking about them yet. And maybe we will ignore costs that will occur 5 years down the road. Maybe not. But I think we're not communicating clearly enough what the costs really are that we are already paying and that we will be paying soon.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to what Nives said just right at the end. we are right now paying the price of climate change all over the world. And yes, it's disproportionately in marginalized communities and in the global south, but in the global north too, and in more economically stable regions and cities. For example, the World Health Organization just recently said that more than half of the world's population is living in an area with worsening air pollution. That is more true than ever in densely populated cities, for example, and that has a whole range of health impacts that we have been paying for many, many years, involving strokes and lung disease and heart disease, and for pregnant mothers and for children. We are already paying those prices, and it's not a distant problem. It's here right now, and we are paying the price.
And you know, a lot of this cost we simply don't internalize. We have a federal agency that subsidizes everyone who builds on the coast, and not just once help them rebuild after a significant weather event, twice, 3 times. We have some properties that have been subsidized 3 times to rebuild. Why don't we simply buy those properties and say, that's it. Once, your federal insurance will bail you out. Second time, we won't. We'll buy your property and we will no longer be building along the coast. Oh, my light turned on. So a lot of these costs, are hidden, and we simply have to internalize them and build them appropriately, and that will have an impact. We're subsidizing way too much.
I would also add that we're also subsidizing agriculture quite a lot. The agriculture in our country has been increasingly impacted by the effects of climate change, from droughts to floods the devastating floods that we've seen in the past couple of years in the Midwest. And the US government and the taxpayers are subsidizing agriculture. And we could stop paying that money if we took better action on climate change.
Let me jump in if I can, because I think the reason I mentioned earlier when I was listing off all the crises I think there are, the last one I mentioned is democracy, and I think it's important because I don't actually think we can get to resolving a lot of these issues with climate change, particularly agricultural subsidies or coastal insurance subsidies or even fossil fuel subsidies, without going through democracy. And right now our democratic systems don't work. Like, and I could bore you for an hour with all the ways that they don't work. We have some mechanisms to improve them, but we have not just problems of public perception and sort of bad voter behavior, people I disagree with have contrary political views or spend too much time on social media. Like, our systems are broken, and they're kind of broken intentionally so that they're not representative. The United States Senate is not representative at all of the country. Plus there's a filibuster laid on top of that. Plus half the states are gerrymandered, blah, 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 blah. So I actually believe that we will not be able to ever get all the way across the finish line on climate issues unless we take really seriously the notion of reforming and restructuring our democracy so that it's actually fair. Because like in agricultural subsidies, to me, is like, that's the case in point. Like, if I would bet $100 to anybody that we cannot reform agricultural subsidies because of our primary system and because of the importance of agricultural states and blah, 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 we're just screwed on that issue unless we go and fix some of the structural issues we have with democracy and money and politics and the rest of that. That's my rant. I know it's maybe a controversial statement, but I really think it's vitally important that we think about democracy as a climate.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Eric, for bringing that up. One of the things I think that maybe Nives, you brought up the issue of trust in science, and I think Kimberly, you mentioned it as well. And I'm really curious about this. And in fact, you know, I have a poll question here. I'm kind of interested in actually asking our audience about confidence in science and how they feel about it. Maybe we could talk about it while they're answering the question. I'm curious, in the opinion of our audience, how has communication and information sharing around COVID-19 affected public confidence and trust in science? Because I think that, Nives, you brought up the point that maybe there were some missteps in the beginning, but overall, when Dr. Fauci speaks, we listen, and perhaps we have some confidence. But I also know that you brought up—
Dr. Burks, let's
Dr.
make
Burks
sure
as
we
well.
have both genders.
Oh, of course. And I mentioned, or you mentioned, I believe, in one of your recent articles about sort of global agencies and the respect and confidence we have in those. And you brought up in particular the IPCC, and you brought up the WHO, and you mentioned that the WHO is having sort of a crisis of confidence. So I'm sort of curious from our panel, and we have gotten a good chunk of our audience responding. So I'm going to go ahead and share with you all what our audience has to say, and then I want to get your opinions as well. Do you think that do we have increased public confidence in science? Do we have more trust in science now? And is the trust that we might be placing around issues of COVID-19, does that translate to trust in science generally, or trust around issues of climate science? So I'm going to go ahead and just show you what our audience said. So it looks like our audience thinks that we have somewhat increased confidence and trust in science. Would you all agree?
Well, one of my slides explicitly stated that the incentives to mistrust or to challenge science is very different in COVID than it is in climate change. Because in COVID, we do not have organized industry that benefits from challenging and mistrusting science on COVID. We all want to solve the problem, we have to move on, right? On the other hand, with global climate change, we have very strong incentives on number of industries. Eric mentioned agriculture. We talked about fossil fuels. So there's very strong incentives, and it's not just about what people trust or who people trust or don't trust. It is who is making it more difficult for us to trust, who's making it more difficult for us to get the appropriate information. So I want to I want to bring back that concern that the motivation and the millions of dollars of lobbying are very different behind climate change and the science related to it than they are behind COVID. That would be my take on this question.
I agree with that. And I think I would also add that there is a big difference in the types of science that we're seeing with climate and with COVID. With climate change, science has pretty much been settled for a while about what the problem is and what we need to do to fix it. And in some ways, that's very, very good in that there's a fixed target in people's minds that they can hone in on about what the problem is and what to do. In some ways, it's bad because there's a fixed target that people can use to attack. With coronavirus, we're very much seeing science in progress, which involves, you know, the best science or the best information changing from day to day. That's how science actually works, and we're seeing it on a very public scale, something that usually happens behind lab doors and then is later released in a press release as, you know, this problem is solved, here's a checkbox. So I think I agree with the majority of the audience members who said that our confidence has somewhat increased, and I would say only somewhat, just because the correct information does change from day to day as we're learning more about the coronavirus and what to do and what the vaccine might be and what medicines might work and the proper actions to take in our personal lives.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. You know, we are quickly reaching the end of our time, and I definitely want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm curious if anyone on the panel would like to share their thoughts on what our audience should or should not do, which they should be taking away from tonight's presentations, and what actions they all should be taking. What would you suggest for any of our audience members that they do in thinking about COVID-19, thinking about climate change, and the actions that they might take?
I'm going to venture out on a limb here.
Good. I like that.
I've got a weird response, but I believe it. So I think that people need to do something that I'm actually pretty bad at, which is get comfortable with uncertainty and get comfortable with the notion that the roadmaps that we've used in the past may not actually guide us very well in the future. I think it's pretty clear that we're entering a world that doesn't look like the world I've inhabited for the last few decades. And that's true economically, it's true for the labor market, it's true for energy and climate and the pandemic, and I think democracy. Like, things are going, in some ways, completely off the rails. And I think we need to be sort of candid about that. In other ways, there's some sort of interesting signs of optimism. But you know, I guess I interact with a lot of folks in my professional life, and it feels like the wisdom that I've extracted from listening to people recently is this notion that, like I said in the slide, change can happen gradually and then suddenly. And I do think we need to consciously sort of adapt a mindset that is more attuned to uncertainty and not knowing. Just like with the coronavirus science, it's changing all the time as we learn more information, which is how science is supposed to work. That's how our brains are supposed to work. But we kind of all want like facts and guide rails and certainty, and the future should be like the past. And it's not going to be like that anymore. Maybe. And I think we'll be better served as sort of climate advocates and as maybe progressives if we can get comfortable in that role. Middle-class white guys like myself don't inhabit that role naturally. We're not used to uncertainty. We're not used to not being able to kind of control our environment. But I think we got to change, and change is going to happen whether we're going to want it or not. So I think we'll be. That's the closest I've got for my. And ride your bicycle. It's nice out.
I see your bicycle in the background there. So, all right, Nives, Kimberly.
Kimberly, is it okay if I go? For me, the COVID, as horrible as it is, as sad as it is, it was an unbelievable learning for our society. And we didn't waste this crisis. We did adapt, we did change. So my wish, my concluding remarks from today is, we as individuals, we as parents, we as workers, and we as leaders and managers have to ask ourselves how much of what we have done in response to COVID could be replicated or could be maintained in the longer term to avoid unnecessary carbon dioxide emissions. That would be, how do we maintain these behavioral changes? Because we were clearly willing to adjust drastically. We've done some very major changes in how we work and how we spend our free time, how we recreate, and so on. We do have beautiful national parks. Do we really have to go to Bali? Just something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think my concluding remarks are actually two different ones. And one, I want to repeat something that was said earlier, and that is that we need to measure the current ongoing cost of climate change for all of us individually and in our communities wherever we live. Because regardless of where you live and who you are, there is a cost that you are paying right now about climate change. And if you don't know what that is, you should find out, because there's probably more than one. And the second, I'm going to repeat myself from earlier and say that you need to talk to people about the crisis that is happening right now. It works. It has worked with the pandemic. We've seen more community action the more that we talk about it with each other. And we need to do the same thing with climate change. So get comfortable talking about these uncomfortable things.
All right. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your thoughts. I really did enjoy this conversation. I wish it could go on, but I also want to be respectful of your time and the time of our audience as well. So I just want to say thank you to all three of you for joining us tonight. I'm going to very quickly share my screen one more time and just point out to our audience that Cascadia Climate Action, as the name implies, is all about action. That's one of the reasons why I asked our panelists for their concluding thoughts. I encourage everyone that's joining us tonight to go to cascadiaclimateaction.org, check out the website, and think about ways that you might be able to take action. Some ideas For instance, you might be able to pick a climate policy or issue from many of the choices and options on cascadiaclimateaction.org's website. Get informed, take some action, engage with a campaign or a group focusing on climate policy. Think about calling or writing your federal, state, or local representatives, letting them know how you think, how you feel about these issues. And then also, please, I encourage you to watch for more events and activities on the cascadiaclimateaction.org calendar. Check out the newsletter as well. We'll be having more of these events in the future. And as I promised earlier, we will definitely be addressing issues of social equity, social injustice as it relates to climate change, because as our panelists mentioned tonight, there are lots of places, lots of issues in which climate change disproportionately affects underrepresented groups, minority groups, and especially the global south as well. So we'll certainly be handling that in the future. I want to just take one more opportunity to thank our panelists so much for joining us tonight. Kimberly, Cartier, Eric DePlace, and Nives Dolsak, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your thoughts. I'd like to also thank the Cascadia Climate Action staff, particularly Amelia Jones and the founder, Mary Manos. And last but not least, I want to thank Peddler Brewing Company and Flying Bike Brewing. We're not there in person, unfortunately. I'm just having a beer here in my basement alone. But if you would like to take advantage of the discount coupon that was distributed with your registration for this event, please do so. Peddler Brewing Company and Flying Bike Brewing have offered some discounts to our attendees. So please visit them, take advantage of that as well. And with that, I would just like to say thank you so much for spending your evening with us. Please, please, please visit the website. Please wear a mask and enjoy your evening and have a great day. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.